This interview is brought to you by Netflix. I'm very happy to be joined by Ru Wiasuria, the creative director on The Order 1886 from Ready at Dawn Studios. Thank you so much for your time. I finally get the chance to ask a question that has just been in my mind about this game. When you first started to present this, I assume the marketers were like, cool, it has 1886 in the title, everyone's gonna fall over themselves for that. I'm using that to frame that, obviously what I've just seen is really, really compelling, but on the face of it, it does present some unique challenges that you don't, it doesn't have dragons on the cover and it doesn't have laser guns.
Yeah, good. Actually, you know what? Maybe we should go back with the dragons and laser guns. It's funny how, like, at the very beginning, I think that everybody has in their minds like this is not going to be the easiest thing to put out there. But tell you the truth, we did a pitch video at the very beginning that took us about 2 weeks to do. It was all concept work with VO on top of it, and it just depicted the demo kind of like the way you see the London that we saw. And funnily enough, actually, everybody jumped on it. I mean, even talking to Sony the first time and just presenting this, it's not like they came back, it's like, oh, they were just gung-ho about it, they were excited about it. That's why we believed in this story and believed in this IP.
And having seen what I saw, as short as it was, yes, I can understand why people were like, hey, there's something neat going on here. Let's talk about the world. Yes, it's London, yes, it's 1886. It is not the 1886 of, it's not historical. No. It's based on some history with some extra things added in.
Absolutely. I mean, the point was really for us to make it believable for people, but give them that twist that would make them question what they saw. And I think that's the interesting part about history itself, is that you can give history some twists and still make it believable. 1886 in our world is grounded in the reality of the London that Victorian era London was. I mean, the beautiful side of Mayfair and Westminster, in some ways that was kind of like the working government side of London. And then Whitechapel on the other side, that's just the downtrodden, dirty side of London that people don't often see, but we really wanted to depict a real side to what they saw. And to that, add that whole twist of not only the technology that we're bringing in that is of the time, but also the lore from the legends and the supernatural that comes into play as well.
I found fascinating is what we saw here was Whitechapel, and as someone who actually lived in that area for a while, not in 1886, I'm not that old, but it actually seems to be as close as to what I believe the historical version was, and that's a smelly, dirty, just absolutely despairing section of this massive metropolis that was London.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was the interesting part about building that. It's what people, I think, don't understand and should expect out of London at that time. I think we had a conversation right before this interview where you just mentioned Dickens. Dickens is probably one of these authors, and probably one of the best authors in the world to like in the way of depicting and describing a world. And what we built through Whitechapel is Dickensian London. It's that downtrodden, place where there's no hope. There's practically no hope at any given time, and I think that's the London that people forget Victorian London era was like, and Whitechapel, specifically Whitechapel in our game, is like that. It's the real London, not the one that you saw in Whitechapel now, but in some ways, in the mood of it, it hasn't changed that much.
And the narrowness of the streets, and you can still see buildings that are of 100, 200 years old. Now, what's interesting is what we saw in this demo is something that I think could have very well happened during the 19th century in the East End, which was sort of an uprising.
Yes.
Nothing as overt as what we saw here occurred, but I was interested to sort of get your sense of how have you kind of played with the politics and the economic disparities that clearly seem to be at the formation of this uprising.
So, I mean, building a story like this, based in reality, there's no way to get around that. London, although London during 1886 was during the Pax Britannia. I mean, it's when things were at peace around the world. UK was the police of the world. There was some real bad conflicts happening in London itself, and London was almost a metaphor, an image of the rest of the world, the way the rest of the world is going. Migration of people, into London, struggles in the streets. Whitechapel, that at the time had, I think, more than 60 brothels. I mean, it's crazy to think about such a small area just having all these problems. But the reality of it is that those were real problems people dealt with. I mean, what we did in the game was kind of bring them up a little bit, like bring the boiling point a little, like bring them to a boiling point by making this uprising not just like an uprising just in the streets, but really an uprising of a movement that got together, the rebellion, rising out of the streets of London, fighting the oppression that they think you are as a player. I mean, you're fighting for the order, and the order is really like, yes, defending mankind, but if you are a knight in this group, you're really viewed as somebody who's defending the well-off.
Yeah, which is quite striking. Usually in video games, it doesn't play that narrative. You're usually on the side of the oppressed. In addition, the 4 characters, 3 of them have names from Arthurian legend. Sir Galahad is probably is the first one everyone's going to recognize in Parsifal. That makes it all the more interesting because sort of the founding myth makers of England seem to be on the side of oppression and keeping the downtrodden as downtrodden as they could be. I assume things might happen later on in the story, but if you could just kind of detail who the Order are in this situation and setting.
I think the interesting about those characters that you brought up, the squad themselves, they reflect in some ways what the mythology of the Arthurian law was. The knights actually stood up to defend the weak, to defend the oppressed. But the reality of it is that by doing what they wanted to do, they also created a certain rule that, in so many ways, they couldn't bring equality to the world as it was back then. I think our knights are the same way. What they're trying to do is kind of, be the kind of the cursed and the people that nobody like because they have a job to do. It's defend humanity. And for them, at the same time as they're defending humanity, in some ways they are building this kind of like segmentation of the world that they don't want, but they don't have time to deal with. For them, it's war.
Or like order is supposed to be something amoral, I guess.
Exactly.
In the case of this, a couple pointed things about the game and those characters. We see the 4 characters. We saw one being played and he was joined by another. Will there be character switching? Is it designed for co-op? I'm still trying to understand sort of why we're highlighting 4 characters, but we see sort of one being played in an instance.
Well, I mean, the game is a single-player game. It's played and viewed through the eyes of Galahad. But the importance of bringing those characters is, again, balance. I mean, one thing great about, for example, novels, is that novels are not always built by the hero. Novels are built by everybody you encounter in the book. I think that's why great stories and immersive stories and stories that you're emotionally attached to are there. More often than not, the hero is a vessel through which everybody else, basically brings, like storylines and emotions and all that. This squad is important because of that, because we wanted Galahad not to be the hero that he is and that he's always going to be. We wanted Galahad to be the person who's going to basically have to assimilate all those things and drive the story forward, but also change in so many ways with all the events. That's again why, I always bring up the idea, like the story of one of the greatest, heroes that were ever built, Batman. Batman is great because of its villains. And that's why I love stories. Stories are great when you can do that, when you can bring other people into the mix to create great stories.
And another thing which I think was heavily intimated when we saw the trailer back at E3 last year, but was not evidenced here in the demo, the sense of supernatural.
Yes.
Yeah, we were just kind of shooting poor people. It's kind of what we just saw in this demo. Is it fair to assume that this gets a little bit more into the realm of the fantastical as it goes on?
Yes, it does get into the sense of into the realm of supernatural. I mean, we shy away a little bit of the fantastic and the magical side of things, but yes, it does go further, and you find out more things, about the supernatural that is part of this world. We teased to it at E3. We wanted to tease to it because it was important that tease was there before we showed you the other side of this kind of 3-sided war. Half-breeds, the order, the government, the law, and the rebellion. Now, yes, there are things that will happen where with the 3-sided war, you don't always fight the same people and you don't know exactly how to fight this war depending on the circumstances. So we showed a little bit of why the uprising happened, or talked about why the uprising happened. The interesting thing will be to know exactly how the order is going to deal with that.
And the one thing we haven't touched on yet, which is the most striking thing about this game, is the way it looks.
Thank you.
Obviously, it's high fidelity. There's a lot of just detail in the animations, but there was something about the look of it that reminded me of an oil painting. I think we've talked about watercolor paintings in a lot of games. This really felt like an oil painting, something that a Dutch master could have done many hundred of years later. I still can't put my finger on what you are doing that's really evoking that visual sense.
It's it's a mix of a lot of things. I would love to pinpoint like one thing and say like, hey, this is what we try to hit with this screen. But it's every effort that went into this project that basically built that visual. From the material system, we talked about it at SIGGRAPH. We try to approach materials in a different way, very realistically. We built a system that allows us to replicate a lot of things, even the texture of things. I mean, they feel palpable. The way we actually approached characters. We didn't want to build a superhero character. We wanted to build characters that were grounded in reality. I think paintings have a beautiful way of doing that, which is that they depict people the way they are, not the way you basically idolize them to be. The world is the same, like the thickness of that air, like that feels like, there's depth, in that the fact that we use camera lenses, like, just the way you would expect out of movies, the fact that lighting is done in such a way that we're trying to replicate not only like lighting that would be reminiscent of the time, but also, sometimes what we would equate to stage lighting, where we can actually make lights actually feel a little bit surreal, but comfortable to your eye that you've already seen them. All of these things, and it's the work of a lot of people at work. It's all of those things that basically create that sense of visuals that, like you said, feel like an oil painting. Feel like you could take a screenshot and that would be just like a painting that someone would do.
And now I have a better understanding of the level of skepticism people had that what we saw at E3 was actually a real-time demo. But I have to say, visually impressive, and I can't wait to learn more. It is coming out in 2014?
Yes, that's the plan.
Well, Rue, I cannot wait to see more about this game. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
If you enjoyed this interview about The Order, then I urge you to check out our sponsors who help make this happen. In this case, it's Netflix. Netflix is the absolute best way to stream your favorite shows and movies without the need for a cable subscription. Get a free trial membership and support Rev3 Games in the process by signing up at netflix.com/Rev3Games.